Okay. So today will be pretty casual because more or less I don't have any particular research project to show other than here's something cool that I found. Let's brainstorm at the end of the sorts of things that we could do with it. And the reason that I wanted to bring to your attention is we've usually broken like qualitative and quantitative into two different camps. And the rationale was basically that quantitative people could deal with lots and lots of data and do really interesting sorts of things, and qualitative people could, you know, do a deep dive or meaning and those sorts of things. But it really wasn't possible for qualitative people to look at lots and lots of data because humans are limited. But that's becoming less relevant than what it was for a few reasons. One is that computer programs are getting smarter all the time. Large amounts of data are becoming freely available and easy to grab, and they're also being structured in a systematic way. So those people that were, back in the old days of the internet, it was a wild, wild west, and there was no real kind of structure. And so if you wanted to look at lots of text, you have to spend, days and days and days of trying to put it into a reasonable format. Nowadays, as I'll show a couple of examples, people are getting much better at structuring things in a similar format that makes life a little easier. So what I want to start with is where this came up was my wife's doing some work on patient-centered care, which is about supporting patient autonomy and those sorts of things. And what she was noticing is she said, I can't seem to find anything on patient-centered care and cultural differences. And all that happens when I search for those two things is I get a lot on cultural change within hospitals and those sorts of things. And I thought to myself, well, there must be a way to download all of the available abstracts and keywords and those sorts of things and have a look for myself in a bit of a smarter format. And so this is where it came from. And from there I started to think, well, those of you that do meta-analyses, you download titles, keywords, abstracts, all of those sorts of things. You screen them, forget about them, and focus on a small subset. But the possibilities of not just extracting little bits of quantitative information and doing a meta-analysis, but having a look at the sorts of theories that people use, the relationships between different authors, the degree to which certain topics are talked about positively versus negatively, who talks about them positively, who talks about them negatively, how close different journals are, how close different authors are in the way they talk about a topic, I think could really start to enhance the sorts of meta-analyses that we do. And so this is where I've been thinking. And so this is kind of a mini tutorial, this is interesting, give me some ideas on what you think you could do, and I'd be happy to listen. So, this is Medline. Medline is really nice for this sort of thing because it's a medical database and the medical people are really good at structuring things. And if you spent any time with Chris and Taryn, you realise that is a personality trait rather than something specific about their field, I'm sure. And so what I really like about it is you can search for mesh headings, which are standardised headings with a specific spelling. And so what we did is we searched for mesh headings, but not just any mesh headings, the major mesh heading that was to do with patient-centered care. And what we came up with was approximately 10,000 articles that use that as a format. What's really nice is once you go through this process in Medline, and it doesn't have to just be Medline, it can be any kind of EBSCOhost type database. Also Scopus and all of those also have this process, but EBSCOhost is much easier than the others. You can email a link that will download all 10,000 for you. From that link, usually we would set it in RSI format so we can upload it into EndNote. But for what we're going to do, we're going to download it as a BibTeX. And the reason that we're going to download it as a BibTeX is because we can read it into R. And the beautiful thing is that we can use a special package in R which is devoted just for reading in BibTeX data into a nice structured format that we can play with. So quite boring, but look, here we are. What's some of the stuff that we can do with this before even looking at text mining? Well, we can look at which journals talk about patient-centered care the most. So we can quickly extract that patient education and counselling has 200 articles. JAMA has 93, so we get an idea of who's publishing. Well, I mean, that's one of the things we want to know, right? Who are the leading authors in this field? So this guy from, I think he's from Deakin, has published 33 times on patient-centered care. Richie, you know any of these people?
I know Ron Epstein.
Yeah, so that's some independent validity there. So that's nice. And we can also extract the publication dates and have a look at what was going on in terms of when were things published. And so what really interested me is that the first ever use of patient-centered care was in 1948. But it clearly didn't have much of an impact. But something happened here that really led to an increase, and again, something dramatic happened here. This is when you started publishing on patient-centered care, Rich? So there's other things you can try. One of the things that, as I said, this was kind of started by a program, so what my wife wanted to know is how often do they use migrant, immigrant, those sorts of things. So we created a dictionary of terms, and a dictionary of terms we didn't want. We filtered that through and we used that, extracted all of the articles that had the sort of pattern we were interested in, and then went through and downloaded those articles in full to have a look at. So that was quite useful. One of the other things that is often useful is sometimes we just want to know which of the review or meta-analysis articles. But really, this is the sorts of stuff that you'd be used to, but what I want to try and pick your brain at is have a think about the sorts of other things that we might be able to do. And this is where we start to move from what you can already do easier through EBSCOhost into something that it cannot do. So what we want to do is we want to take these random strings of words and turn them into something that we can easily analyze. Now, I started doing text mining stuff probably 2 or 3 years ago, and it was constantly frustrating because the way that data was stored for text mining was incredibly idiosyncratic. You couldn't easily look into what was going on. It was incredibly frustrating. And then one of my favorite programmers created something called Tidy Text, and some of you will remember that some of her stuff is based on Jane Austen's novels, and so I got a little obsessed with text mining Jane Austen novels for a while. But what's really nice is it provides a way of really easily getting data into a format that we are incredibly used to dealing with. So we're going to do a few things. What we're going to do is we're going to create a database that has 1 word per row, with columns that describe where that word came from, who the author was, what the decade was, those sorts of things. What we're going to do also is we're going to get rid of stop words. Do people know what stop words are? Stop words are the things we don't care about. I don't want to know about and, but, I, those sorts of things. But realistically, could've, should've, those sorts of things, I don't want to know about those either. And so there's been a recent development which took stop words of I, but, and, where there was about 20 of them. This is a list of about 516 words that I don't care about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of those. The other thing that I might...
Is that your list that's idiosyncratic to this
No,
one?
this is embedded into R.
Okay.
So stop words, smart ones.
Okay.
The other thing that I'm going to do is I might think about stemming some of the words. So what that means is that migrant, migrants, migration, they're not really different topics, and so I want to just treat them all as the same. So what I'm going to do is cut all of the suffixes off the end of words and just keep the bit that I care about. Now these are all decisions that you would have to make, and there's no real right one. You may want to keep the stop words. So I know that Rob was saying, for instance, that he really wanted to know what words followed should. It's because that's an indication of the sorts of moral imperatives that people are invoking. Also, one of the things I'll show you a little bit later is I want to see how people use adjectives. And so in that case, I wouldn't get rid of stop words. Again, here, this might be useful for when you want to extract themes, but at other times you might be interested in how people are using language, so you wouldn't do that. So these are all the sorts of decision-making processes that need to go on. and there's no right answer. Once you clean all of this up, now let's remember where this started. Where this started was a really messy piece of text with lots of curly brackets, all sorts of stuff, and what we have now is one word per line, what line in the abstract it was from, whether it's in a top journal, so a journal that was a top 10 or below, what decade it was in. Now, decade is, I've used a bit loosely. What I've done is just cut them into even lots of 10. What year it was in, what journal it's in, and just a nice little ID, which is the lead author, the year, and the journal, which I could then easily Google if I wanted to know more information. So from here, all of the sorts of standard analyses that you learnt in R or SPSS apply. You can do anything that you want to do. So, what are some of the things that we can do? Well, one of the things that I got bored on the weekends and was that I web harvested all of the names of countries, and I looked through those things and I counted up the amount of countries that are mentioned. So, in terms of patient-centred care, Australia leads the way, followed by Germany, with Norway rounding up the rear. These are the most frequent words that are used, minus some ones that are obviously things that I don't want. So I got rid of things like patient and centred and care because that was the keyword I searched for. So, you know, some of it's kind of boring, but some of it's interesting. So patient-centred care, there's a lot of stuff going on about the administration type stuff and about standards and about nursing. And this starts to tell me things, because I know a little bit about patient-centred care, that make me start to trust this. So I know, for instance, that some of the complaints about patient-centred care recently is it's been turned into checklists, and people feel that that's really restrictive, that it's become too much of a bureaucratic type ideal. And so that makes me think, yeah, maybe this is coming across here and here. And I also know that the people that have been really leading the way on patient-centred care have been nurses. And so that gives me some ideas. Also, what I might want to start to do is to look at the relationships between words. I've made this deliberately useless because a graph of value was too big to fit on a page. So this is words that are correlated, which means they co-occur 98% of the time. So some of them obviously are quite dumb. If you're, I think it's an American health insurance agency called Blue Shield, is that right? Yeah, so Blue and Shield co-occur 98% of the times, which is unsurprising. Things like Saudi and Arabia turn up all of the time. It's not all that interesting, but once you take that correlation down from 98% to 80%, you start to see, rather than these three-word things, real clusters start to emerge. So you might remember we did this with the self-conference abstracts, and what we essentially found is that if you text-mined the abstracts of the self-conference, you ended up with two opposing, completely separate camps that you can see a split down the middle here with Herb on one side and Rich on the other. The abstracts were to do with self-concept or self-determination theory, and never should those two meet.
We tried it.
We're working on that. We're working on that. Just a little.
Now, one of the things that I think is a complaint that I have a little bit with text mining is that it's, and Rich and I were just talking about it, it's completely inductive, but also often run by people that have an interest in the cool computing and none of the actual technical stuff. So I think there is often value in that inductive process, and we'll get to, I think, a way of better structuring that inductive process a little bit later. But it also might be worth looking a bit deductively. And so I was talking to Rich about patient-centred care, and Rich mentioned that some of his work on autonomy had really been taken up by these guys, and it really seemed to gel. And so what I wanted to know was, okay, well, what are the words that are associated with, at least in my mind, aspects of autonomy from a self-determination theory, and what are they most related to? So I picked words of autonomy, disclosure, consent, and something else that we'll see. I wanted to know was what words are most correlated with these different things. And so, you know, some of this stuff might be interesting or it might not. There's a real kind of idea within patient-centred care of this difficulty to do with truth-telling and disclosure, which comes up really strongly here. And where you might be thinking about this is that we have this kind of Western ideal that people must know the disease that they have and what their prognosis is. But often there's a really strong feedback from patients that says, well, I don't want to know, from some sorts of patients. And so there is this real tension within patient-centered care about truth-telling and disclosure around disease. So that doesn't surprise me. This kind of thing of informed consent, those sorts of things, refusals of consent, that's kind of interesting. This to me is probably the most interesting, because in patient-centered care, there's this real aspect also of it's not just about the patient, the doctor giving the information and the patient deciding what to do. There is a sense in which there needs to be a kind of a relational type thing. And so one of the complaints that you hear a lot is that a doctor will say, well, here's an issue, here are your ideas, what do you want to do? And the patient responding, well, you're the doctor, you tell me what to do. And so there was a real movement within patient-centered care to have shared decision making. And so these sorts of things is starting to let me know that, okay, there could be some value here. Again, I guess.
Sorry, Phil, just a quick question on the data structure. Are these words that appear anywhere in the abstract with it, or how close to that to be?
It's correlation within the same abstract. Now, you could do all sorts of stuff. You could do correlation within the same line, correlation within the same journal, correlation within the same author, those sorts of things. And that's where it starts to get interesting, is when you start to add those sorts of layers. So, it might be interesting to look at the words that are most correlated with autonomy for different authors, those that have, different views of what autonomy might or might not be. So there's a general audience of people that are writing about relational autonomy in this area from Austria, and so it might be interesting to get that Austrian school and have a look at how they talk about autonomy versus people that maybe haven't really thought through those issues as clearly and how they talk about it. So combining some of these sorts of things you're talking about, I think, is where it becomes interesting. Of course, you can't have a text mining talk without looking at sentiment. Some of these are kind of ridiculous, but what I want to do is just invoke some of the ideas of what we could be doing as a team and where we might want to go with this. So I'll give you an example of where I think things can become a little bit more interesting later. But we might want to look, for instance, about what's the most positive journal about patient-centered care and what's the most negative journal. So if you're going to go to JAMA, make sure you're really critical. Whereas if you're going to go to the Journal of General Internal Medicine, patient-centered care is awesome. What to me was most interesting was...
Sorry, Phil, can I just interrupt there for a second? So, this is sentiment's done by sort of the words, obviously, in sort of negative standard words. So, are we not inferring a little bit too much there? I mean, because I've read some papers in JAMA about this topic, and the ones that I've read, that's a very small sample, but they've been basically saying that physicians are really rubbish at patient-centered care. They need to improve.
Yeah, no, I'm just talking about it for giggles, so I'm not making I mean, this is all the preemptive stuff, and really what I'm going to talk about in a moment is computational grounded theory, and really I suppose the main point I want to say is text mining on its own is not useful. Okay. What you need to do is have text mining which directs the human to things to look at in detail. And so what I would do, if this was a research program, what I might do is I might say, okay, this is quite interesting, this discrepancy. I'm going to pull out 10 representative articles out of both of those and have an in-depth look at how they talk about patient-centered care. Where this might become more interesting, I think, is this one here, and this is the sentiment over time from what I've limited to is that, that first uptake in 1995, and you can see the sentiment with the degree of positive words used as changes over time. To me, that's interesting, and I'd want to know why. And one of the, the intuitive hypotheses I develop is that when patient-centered, when any new topic is introduced, it's introduced positively. There are very few, it's not only introduced positively, but within a restricted space. And over time, I guess that what you'll have is an increase of people talking about where it doesn't work. So there has been a big uptake in recent times about where patient-centered care doesn't work. An example of where there's been some real criticism is in relation to the relationship between patient-centered care and cultural competent care. And the reason is that patient-centered care, the way it comes across, tends to invoke ideas of autonomy as independence, autonomy as informed consent, autonomy as having to know what disease that you've got. Whereas cultural competence care often says, well, it depends on circumstance. So there has been some criticism that started to really take off in the last couple of years. Now again, you notice that I'm using information that I know from the field. One of my criticisms, again, of text mining is that often it's done by PhD graduates in computer science who don't care what the topic is. And that computer-human interface, I think, is really, really important for this area. To develop inductive hypotheses. Now, what we might do, and to preempt some of the ideas of computational theories, we might look at this and say, okay, I've got an inductive hypothesis. I'm going to extract, 4 articles per decade, have a look what they have to say, develop some hypotheses that I can put into kind of statistical reasoning, and then test that back again with the data. And so that idea of computer first, human second, computer again, I think is a really nice model for this text mining idea. Okay, parts of speech. This is where I think it's really cool, and I have no idea what to do with it. So if you've got some ideas, then that's great. I have a gift coming up. Okay, so one of the things that is quite interesting is the way that people use adverbs, right? So adverbs are the things that add to verbs. Now, the thing that can follow a verb could be positive or negative. So realistically, this is not something that is going to be all that interesting in patient-centered care, but there are other places where it might be. You want to know, for instance, that people that use relatively often then follow that with some positive words or some negative words. Also, less is an adverb that can be followed by positive or negative words. Look, realistically, I don't know that that's all that interesting for this topic, but it might be from other areas. But another thing that I want to pull through is, I don't know if you've noticed, but repeatedly I've used this idea of dictionaries. So the way that I've got the data set up at the moment is a word per row from whatever we've got. Now a dictionary is just a word per row. And what we want to do is bring those things together and filter out anything that doesn't fit. Now, where I did this was I had a dictionary of adverbs. So I could extract all of the adverbs and the words that followed it. Beforehand, I told you I scraped from the web a list of country names, which is just a dictionary, country per row. I could filter, extract, and count. Now, some of those kind of dictionaries are pretty boring, right? Sentiment analysis is also a dictionary. Positive words is one dictionary, negative words is another dictionary, put them together and count. Boring. But you can start to get some more interesting ones. And this is my one that I think is really interesting. Has anybody read Jonathan Haidt's work on moral psychology, The Righteous Mind, that became really famous after the Trump election? So he has these virtues here. And together with some friends of his, he created a dictionary of just random terms here. They're literally random, so this is the first time I've seen this particular iteration. But you get some ideas. So harm virtue is about things like care, sympathy, those sorts of things. Its opponent is war, fight, harm, rah, 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 all of those kind of stuff. I'll let you have a quick look for a minute. Now, here's where I want you to do some work. We've been talking about articles from BibTech on patient-centered care. Kind of boring to run this against. So what's more interesting? So this weekend, I sent a little web crawler to download 23,000 speeches by Prime Ministers of Australia dating back from John Curtin through to Tony Abbott. I have this in a plain text format. If anybody wants these speeches, come and see me. You'll have all the tools you need to do all sorts of fun stuff. I've extracted 4 Prime Ministers who I thought might be that those young ones among us would know about. So I picked Tony Abbott and John Howard from Liberal, and I picked Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd as, I'll see, this is where, John Howard and Tony Abbott as right wing, Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard as left wing, and in my mind, knowing I think where they are, I kind of situated them from far right to far left, where I've gone Tony Abbott, John Howard, Julia Gillard, and Kevin Rudd as the most left. We'll see if I'm right. Now, what I want you to think about is, in general terms, left wing versus right wing, who will be higher on which ones, who will be lower on which ones, and in general terms, what do Australian politicians talk about in terms of moral language? Does anybody want to hazard any kind of guesses or hypotheses before we have a look? There are no prizes, just for fun.
I could do one. Run with the apologies. He gave out, he had, I think, 2 or 3 apologies.
Yeah, so where would that fit in these kind of things? Maybe here?
Well, here's the thing: is language was oftentimes very about apologizing. So it was like we were unfair. It was like fairness bias, maybe.
Okay. Yeah.
Maybe.
Good. Hold on to that.
Okay.
Wouldn't Height say that the more right wing would hit all of the sort of vibe?
Yeah, that's not fair because you've read his book. But we'll see. This is an independent. I mean, so his stuff is all on the US. This is an independent replication of whether that's right or not. We'll see.
Yeah. I think if we were going all category vice versus virtue, we'd be going right versus left. But I think fairness virtue is going to be left, and I think authority vice is going to be right.
Okay. I mean, I've got time, so we can come up with another one. Terry's got. But hopefully, you've all got in your mind some ideas.
There's a righteousness that I mentioned to you. Yeah, that sort of is that last category.
Yep, and left or right.
Huh?
Left or right.
Oh. Abbott.
Static claim. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, has everyone got some hypotheses in their mind?
Yeah.
This is impartial. I'm not being political. I'm totally apolitical. I just think it's interesting that we can have a look at the graphs. So, Herb, Tony Abbott leads the way in those kind of righteous terms by a long way. The other ones that are interesting is he also leads the way by a long way in harm vice. These are things like traitor, war, killing, those kind of terms. What's interesting is in-group virtue, the communist type words, commune, community, all of those sorts of things. Kevin Rudd's out in front. What interests me is I don't know what's going on with Julia Gillard, but she had a real thing for purity, virtue. I don't know what that's about. But I don't know, does any of that surprise you? I mean, to me, I don't think this supports Jonathan Haidt's work at all. In fact, I think what this suggests is that there are... So Jonathan Haidt thinks that right-wing kind of talks about all moral foundations relatively flatly, and that left-wing only really care about this one and this one. And really, I don't think, at least from an Australian perspective, and for these, the last 4, excluding Malcolm Turnbull, I don't think he's right.
What are the in-group virtue words, Bill?
Family.
See, last time I ran this,
Just working
it was like, it sounded totally communist. This table is generated randomly each time. So it's always a little bit of a surprise to me, but yeah, last time it made them look like a massive communist. All right, so look, that was just for fun. It's completely off the topic of what we're looking at, but it took me all weekend, and so if I had to do it, you have to look at it. Okay, it's really good.
I might add that my daughter, who's a presenter on ABC, I told her that what you were doing, and she wants you to come give a talk on ABC about the Prime Minister. She thinks you're going to be a media king for her.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I really want to do is turn this into a website and have you can choose the politicians and have a battle royale. So Tony Abbott versus John Curtin, who wins? I think that would be exciting. No, maybe not.
Look, you have to do that. You absolutely have to do that.
Mike, let's talk up.
Yeah. And you may not use like Too busy as it is.
This to me is really exciting. This paper is in Sociological Methods. It is not published yet. It came online first just a month ago. I came across it completely by accident. It's called Computational Grounded Theory. And this is from a person who was a real pure qualitative researcher who has developed some skills, incredibly impressive skills, in text mining, and has really found a way to bring the two things together. And to me, I think that this is a real possibility of a shake-up of how we do research. And the reason I think that is that one of the reasons I've shied away from qualitative research in the past is because, well, I can only look at 7 or 10 people at a time, and realistically, how generalisable is that? And this is a way of looking at mammoth amounts of text. Now, the text, plain text that I'm looking at is in the realm of 200 megabytes. This is 10 times the size of some of the like PISA type databases that we're looking at. So they're huge. We can start to do some interesting things. And her general approach, here's the reference for those that are interested here, is this multi-step process. First, we use the computer to do the boring stuff. I don't know how many of you have done NVivo and had to do that incredibly boring coding process of coming up with themes. Forget about that. Let's let the computer do that. So that's step one. We're going to let the computer do all of that kind of nonsense. Then what we're going to do is we're going to look at the themes. Now, we could draw any number of themes. We could draw 10, we could draw 50, we could draw 100. So we're going to start to use our intuition by looking at the results. Pick a number of themes that seems to do a couple of things. So what she looks for is the number of themes that don't artificially split categories that realistically do look similar versus those that are combining themes that really should be separated. So she's using an intuition from the results from this sort of thing, which is, or forgive me if you're wrong, is the kind of thing that you would do in NVivo anyway. It's just that computer does it in less than a second, and for us it takes much, much longer. From there, you can calculate the probability that any given document contains a given theme. And so what you can do there, and what I'm in the process of doing, is extracting n documents with probability of greater than 95% or 90% of containing a given theme, and doing a real deep read on that. From that deep read, come up with some hypotheses that can be shaped in a way that can be applied via a computer program to the full data text. And then test the theory via text mining. So the example that she gives, which I think is really fascinating, is there's a huge corpus of documents from two feminist groups around the time of second wave feminism. And one was from a large group in New York, and one was from a large group of from Chicago. And what she was wanting to look at is, how do different groups that are fairly independent do feminism differently? And so she went through this process, extracted, I think it was about 40 themes, really had a close look at them and realised that realistically only 12 of those made sense. She extracted, I think, about 10 documents per theme of those two things and had a real look at what was going on. And what she was finding is that there was really one central difference, and that was that the Chicago Feminist School was really interested in philosophy and making speeches and those sorts of kind of political activities. In contrast, the New York feminists were really interested in doing stuff. Opening schools, opening bookstores, concrete sorts of things. And so, if this was true, she hypothesised, the Chicago texts should have a lot of abstract nouns, whereas the New York ones should have lots of concrete nouns or proper nouns. And retested that through, and she showed very strong support for that, which I think is a really nice way of that computer first, human second, developing some really nice, interesting hypotheses back to the computer to test it. I'm really starting off on this, and there's some stuff I don't really know how to do. When you've got a lot of text data, the question is do you throw all of the text at the theme generation or only some text? One of the things I'm toying with is maybe just concentrating on a few journals or a few authors and doing what's called term frequency. And what this is here is this is the top, say, 6 journals. And these are the words that are used most by those journals, controlling for the number of times those sorts of words appear across all journals. So what these are the words that are most specific to a given journal. Now, I don't know if journals are the right way to do it. I think maybe picking, say, particular authors that are representative of distinct camps might be a way to do it, and so on and so forth. I'm not really sure. But this would be an idea of, rather than throwing the automatic theme generation in every word, throwing it at a restricted set. And so, for instance, I don't know if Patient Education and Counselling is a journal from Ireland, but clearly they love Ireland. I don't know if that's relevant, and this makes me think that maybe this is not the right approach to go, but this is a real work in progress. Here to me, this is interesting. The nursing side of things, I said that they're the ones that were really leading the way on patient-centred care. And really where they were leading the way is in relation to geriatric care. And you can see that start to come up here, and in the other nursing journal here. These ones are really about relationship to sort of putting it into the policies and procedures of the hospital itself. This is clearly a whole bunch of acronyms that I have no idea what they mean, but if I was in patient-centred care, I suppose that I would. And that's why I'm hoping that my wife, who does this sort of stuff, will know what this means. Okay, so let's say that we've extracted a restricted set. For the purposes of today, I've just thrown it all of the text. And what we're really looking for is to do a factor analysis of the text. What we're going to assume is that there are some latent factors that underlie the text, and that through factor analysis we can start to extract some of those. There's lots of different ways of doing that. My favourite one at the moment is called structured topic models. It's my favourite because I can actually pronounce it. The other one, latent something starting with D, analysis, I can't pronounce, so I chose not to use that one. But that's another option if you're interested in. But no, realistically, LDA, whatever D means, I don't remember, has been the leader for a long, long time. But structured topic models is relatively new, and it's really interesting. And the reason that it's really worth looking at is it looks at the number of factors, latent factors, that underlie a corpus of text conditioned on the actual documents that make up the corpus of text. So it really is trying to find a way of looking at what are the really unique themes that sit within a corpus of text, and it's quite interesting. I extracted 30 topics, but they don't fit on a slide, so here's the first 6. To me, this really suggests some really interesting stuff. Topic 1 really is about women's health. Over here, what we have is a set of articles that are really talking about veteran affairs and the importance of patient-centred care to do with veterans. What you would see if I had more words here is words like Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. Here, we talked about beforehand that one of the complaints about patient-centred care was it has become too bureaucratic, it's become too checklisty. And there are a lot of articles on developing checklists for patient-centred care. This one here is to do with chronic diseases. And again, as I mentioned, if you know patient-centred care, you know it's been led by the nursing fraternity. And so there's a lot here about changing the culture and so on and so forth and the ways of working for nurses. Is there any questions on that? Because it's a little complicated.
Did you say that it takes into account some kind of nesting structure, like the journals?
Yes. So the nesting structure in this case is the journals. The nesting structure could be authors, it could be countries, it could be anything. I don't yet know the question that you'll next ask, which is whether you can do a 3-level model. I don't know, but this is at least a 2-level model.
Tell me a little bit about the development of themes that you was the starting point. of your computational grounded theory. How does that work?
So this is pure. This, at least in this instance, it's completely computer generated without any of my input whatsoever. So I didn't restrict at all.
How does it develop the themes? What does it do? What's the algorithm, or what's the process? Or?
I'll send you the article with the map. But it essentially is what Teresa was saying. Is it's a two-level factor analysis.
Okay.
But it's a relatively complicated piece of machinery that I don't feel quite capable of explaining in this space or any space.
So is this all done in a package, or have you written out some of this?
No, this is all. So I use the tidy text package for most things. Obviously, the graphs producing ggplot, but there's a structured topic modeling package. But it doesn't have to be within this format. You could also throw out LDA. Previously, I used the inverse term frequency or some combination thereof. Where this might become more interesting, guys, and one of the ones I want to look at is from here. You could also start to look at, well, we had those lists of 10 top authors. Which of these themes do they hit? Or what journals focus on this versus this versus this? Those sorts of things is where it can become quite interesting. Where I'm at this stage is handing over to my co-author of giving her a list of articles that most probably contain a given theme. So theme 1 was, from memory, women's health. And so these 2 articles most probably contain that theme. So we're going to extract those and do a deep read, extract those, do a deep read, and from that deep read, develop some hypotheses that we can put into text mining type language to then test. And the answer is really no, but that's where you guys come in, because I'm intrigued to see. I think this is a place that could become really big. I wanted to make you aware of some of the things that we could do, and the question is it worth doing, and what should we be doing if we are going to do it? I think it's something that could fit alongside things like meta-analyses. I think it's something that could fit aside when we're starting to collect large amounts of text data, and hopefully it gives you a way of thinking about things a little differently and triggers some ideas of what to do. Questions, comments, queries, complaints?
What do I tell Cassie?
Hey, give me time. Mike and I have got to develop the Prime Minister boxing match.
That was amazing. Just a quality of life question. Once you have selected articles you want to read, do you send a scraper out to go find PDFs, or do you then do some manual searching to get the articles?
Well, so you can export as a BibTeX, and then I assume we could search through paper file or something like that, right, Taryn? So that will be the plan. But the idea is to not read everything. The idea is to reduce as much as possible. So realistically, we might only extract 6 or 7 themes that are really coherent and are not themes of uninteresting nonsense. So we're probably only looking at, reading somewhere in the realm of 20 articles, maybe a few more.
Yeah.
But talk to Taryn. Taryn got me onto using PaperPile for automated finding of PDFs, and so I don't know enough about it, but if what Taryn's saying is right, I'm hoping that it will simplify my life a great deal.
Can you have a stab at how the themes, I don't know, Herb asked the question, you begged off it, but it's always been the big problem is configurations of words as opposed to individual words. So is that what the theme's trying to do? Is it trying to...
Yeah, look, realistically what it's looking at is the number of times words co-occur within a specific context that would be unusual if you looked across the entire context. So what it's looking at is, remember I showed that correlation graph? It's more or less taking that correlation graph and dividing it into subunits. So remember how I said if we expanded it from a correlation of 0.98 to say a correlation of 0.7 or whatever, you'd start to see these clusters start to emerge. And so it's a way essentially of drawing a really big one of those and then pruning out bits and pieces.
Yeah, okay.
And so the really critical thing, and I've just started with this, is it's really dependent, I suppose, as all analyses are, on the quality of data that you put in. So just throwing data at it can return absolute nonsense. So when we did it with the self-help tracks, for instance, they were so disparate and all over the place that it was finding the disparities, but they weren't interesting because they were just such different topics. But topics that were uninteresting. So that's why there needs to be some kind of preemptive thing. And so that's where it requires knowledge of the field to be able to say, well, look, these are the 10 journals and these are the 5 authors that are really important. Let's just focus on them. Let's not look at every word, let's just look at some specific words. Then there's all of those things about, do we get rid of stop words? Do we stem words? Do we leave it in the natural setting? Those sorts of things. The other thing that I didn't show you that was hiding behind that adjective thing is that I showed you that you had 1 word per row, but it doesn't have to be 1 word per row. You can choose any number of words. So instead of it being 1 word, you could look at n-grams of 2 words. So, you could start to look at phrases, or it could be 1 sentence per row, and you could start to look at it that way. So there are a lot of options, and realistically, I suppose that complaint about text mining being the hobby of the computer literate with no... I think that's why it hasn't been as successful as what maybe it should be. And by combining knowledge of the domain space, you can start to generate stuff. And you can see this now with... it's really taking off in politics. So there was some claims back... The second term of Obama, that text mining of Twitter was a better predictor of the final outcome of the election than any of the opinion polls were. So, there are some places where detailed subject knowledge and computer smarts are starting to come together with really good effect.
I heard something similar about, and even more powerful, about Google searches, apparently.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So they were able to predict down at sort of the county level by looking at sort of what people were searching through Google, because they were more likely to sort of reveal themselves in their Google searches than they were even in an opinion poll or especially on a Twitter post.
Yeah, and I mean you're a little you're differentially filtered in Twitter or social media than you are when you're filling out a survey, and so I think it does provide a way of, I don't think it's a replacement for, but it's definitely an and that can provide different contexts. So one of the things that I really want to do is I'm pushing Rich to provide me with a dictionary of autonomy, frustration support, competence, frustration support, and relatedness, frustration support, and start to find ways that we can find dimensions to put politicians within that space to see how they're trying to trigger out our needs. What are the ways they're trying to play our basic psychological needs? And so, one of my favourite things is Political Compass, which provides a 2x2 grid, and it puts political parties and it puts politicians within that grid. And I think it'd be really interesting to have something like that in relation to basic needs and to be able to plot our politicians and see what they're doing.
From the way the data is set up in R then, could it be combined with other quantitative data? So for example, could we use this for strengthening some kind of policies or documents and then link that to the principles or to achievement things?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question, and that's one of the ideas. I mean, that's an excellent example. One of the ones that I've also wanted to do in the original idea with the Prime Minister's database that I gave up with, because I've only found this tidy format in recent times. When I first downloaded it, it was in an impossible way that made merging databases nearly impossible. One of the things I'm quite interested in is looking at the way in which politicians' use of sentiment, positive versus negatively valenced words, correlates with the subjective well-being of the populace. And so what you would do is you would calculate the sentiment per year, and then merge with the database of population well-being by year, or Indigenous versus non-Indigenous, so on and so forth, and be able to pull those things together. And so the only realistic thing I had a look at was the way in which Indigenous people are talked about by Prime Ministers and its relationship to key events like the apology and those sorts of things. But yeah, this is where it starts becoming interesting, is merging with other data sets at meta levels, countries, dates, locations, so on and so forth.
Just brainstorming, I don't have any background in computer knowledge at all, so please correct me if I'm completely wrong. But similar question, can you scrape data from, say, Facebook groups? And then I'm thinking, because there's all of these university specific for a unit or for a discipline Facebook groups, and then analyze themes to then do things like correlational work with, say, university rankings, correlational work with disciplines. So if certain themes come out for med students compared to education students, or that kind of thing.
I mean,
is that feasible?
I think you certainly could be in the past tense. I think Cambridge Analytic might put a cobblers on that.
Sure.
But yeah, you can mine your own Facebook stuff, and I've done that in the past. It's relatively easy.
Sure.
A lot of these things, particularly Twitter and those things, have really easy to use what are called APIs, which are they're designed to help people who want to do research extract data in a simple way.
Okay.
So certainly.
Yeah.
But yeah, I can't give any specific knowledge. You have to look at the terms and conditions. But in theory, yeah, of course, absolutely.
Great.
Where you might be able to do it is that a lot of universities have Blackboard or those sorts of things where and that becomes interesting.
Sure. Thanks.
All good. 5 minutes early, Mark.
Can you link it to? I'm just thinking about self-concept research. Whether you could tie sentiment to particular pronouns such as I, me.
Yeah, that's one of the ones I wanted to really look at. Yeah.
So, where does that come into that process?
So the process that where I've done it beforehand, and it was the adverb type example, is that adverb example behind it is I'm pulling out not one word, but 2 words at a time, and then splitting them into 2 and saying every time the word I appears, what's the most frequent positive or negative word to follow that? It's the way that you could do it. It would be relatively simple. Where text mining becomes really useful is people who are content experts developing high quality dictionaries. So if Herb was to come up with a dictionary of multi-dimensional self-concept terms, then you could do that, but it is all dependent on the quality of the dictionary. And so one of the other things that I think we should be looking at is what are the sorts of dictionaries that we can generate. Basic need satisfaction is an obvious one, but it's not the only one. There are lots of different ones that
Core design principles in prosocial.
Exactly, yeah. So at the moment you're looking at it with a survey, but you need to look at it. I mean, you could create a dictionary and picking up on Cameron's idea is pulling out email listservs or Slack chat within an organisation and see how the core design principles are being used within Slack chat or whatever.
I didn't quite understand it, but I heard a presentation about how Google Translate translates languages, and it's using the same sort of principles, the same kind of text mining principle. And I was just fascinated at how effective that they're able to do. Yeah.
And it's a sign of how well they do that there are a lot of jokes of how badly it does in some circumstances. I mean, if it was bad all the time, it would be interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah. Thanks, guys.
Yeah.